Tensions between Russia and NATO are reaching boiling point, with both sides claiming that they're preparing for the threat of war with the other. If that happens, the conflict would spread throughout Europe and, thanks to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, would draw in other major Western powers such as the United States. And there's one region that lies at the center of it all: Kaliningrad. Russia's enclave is situated in the perfect place to serve as a launching point for an attack, and it's long been considered a risky area by many in the West. Now that risk may soon be realized, which leads us to the question we'll answer in this video. Why will Kaliningrad be at the center of a war between Russia and NATO? To answer that question, we first need to offer some insight into what Kaliningrad is and what it represents to Russia. Kaliningrad traces its roots back to the 13th century, when it was founded as Königsberg by the Teutonic Knights. Since then, it's passed through several different hands, with the Hanseatic League once claiming the region as well as Prussia, which named Königsberg its capital. However, it was World War II that saw the region fully enter the Russian sphere of influence. The 5,830 square mile patch of land, which is sandwiched between Lithuania, Poland, and the Baltic Sea, became a key strategic location during that war. It was bombed extensively by both German and Soviet forces, with the Soviet Union eventually coming out on top. That enabled it to annex the region, transforming it into the Kaliningrad Oblast. The Soviet Union wasted no time in making use of its new land. After expelling most of the remaining Germans, it transformed Kaliningrad into a closed military zone. Heavy industrialization took place, though there was little to stop the Soviet Union from doing what it wanted with the oblast. After all, Lithuania was under Soviet rule as well, meaning it had direct access to Kaliningrad. To all intents and purposes, Kaliningrad was part of Russia. That changed following the fall of the Soviet Union and the entry of the Baltic states into the EU. Though Kaliningrad was and still is part of the Russian Federation, it became cut off. Russia couldn't transport anything into the oblast by land without passing through EU territory first, as both Poland and Lithuania joined the organization in 2004. That fact has led to growing tension. That's particularly the case in Lithuania, where friction over transit regulations has been common, according to the BBC. Nevertheless, Russia has worked hard to not only maintain control over the oblast, but to ensure that it plays a key role in its current military strategy. It's now home to Russia's Baltic Fleet, which is believed to contain 1 submarine and 43 surface vessels, and it represents the only ice-free port Russia has in Europe. That's a crucial distinction. Kaliningrad's Baltiysk is the only European port Russia owns that it can use all year round. But despite being owned by the Russian Federation, Kaliningrad is something more of a Europe-centric Russian territory. As the BBC demonstrates, the construction of a $45 million airport terminal in 2007, coupled with Kaliningrad's proximity to several EU countries, saw it increasingly trading with nations outside of Russia. That trade led to a growing economy and improved industrial output, though both were put to the test by the global financial crisis of 2008. Back then, Kaliningrad's unemployment levels rose to 10%, much higher than the Russian average of the time, and may have sown some seeds of discontent in the oblast that we'll explore later. Still, Kaliningrad remains extremely important as a tactical location for Russia, and that brings us back to the prospect of war between Russia and NATO. If it were to erupt, why would Kaliningrad be at the center of it all? Part of the answer comes down to missiles, specifically Russia's short-range Iskander ballistic nuclear missiles, which the BBC claims have been in Kaliningrad since at least 2013. At the time, Russia was cagey about whether it had deployed missiles to the oblast, though it later confirmed the reports in 2016. The countries bordering Kaliningrad expressed their dismay. Both Poland and Lithuania reacted with shock, with the latter claiming the move may have violated international weapons treaties, while the Polish government in a subdued response called the action very alarming. Back then, Lithuania accused Russia of using nuclear weapons to seek concessions from the West amidst growing tensions over its actions in Syria. Lithuania also pointed out that it had tracked several Russian military exercises in the oblast, including some scenarios in which troops stationed in Kaliningrad would launch Iskander missiles. Russia played coy. At the time, it dismissed the concerns, claiming the contingents of missile troops have been moved many times and will continue to be moved to the Kaliningrad region as part of a Russian armed forces training plan. Western commentators weren't being fooled by Russia's 2016 claims. One of those commentators was Judy Dempsey, who serves as a senior associate at the European base of the Carnegie Endowment. She claimed that the Iskander deployments were intended to divide the West and were timed specifically to disrupt the looming US presidential elections. These types of moves by Russia are making the Europeans and the US nervous, she claimed, before adding, Putin is pressing all the buttons. In other words, the deployment of Iskander missiles was an intimidation tactic aimed specifically at Poland and the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Russia's message was simple: we have nuclear weapons in a location from which we could easily launch them at any of you. And that message was accompanied by the unspoken, but no less dangerous, message that its Iskanders could hit almost any European nation from Kaliningrad. Given that most of Russia's potential targets are NATO members, using them would trigger a global war. Of course, we know that didn't happen in 2016. Still, the threat of the Iskanders in Kaliningrad persists. Those missiles are still there, and they present a clear danger. The 9K720 Iskander, also known as the SS-26, is a 23.9-foot road-mobile missile that's capable of carrying a nuclear payload between 1,058 and 1,543 pounds. Russia began development on the missile in the 1980s, intending it to be a replacement for the OTR-23, which was banned under the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It's far from being the rangiest missile in the Russian arsenal, as it's only capable of traveling 310 miles. That would be a problem if it was only stationed in the Russian mainland. However, the missile's presence in Kaliningrad means that the range is more than enough to hit most potential targets in Europe. The Baltic states are under clear threat. The same goes for the Nordic states, as well as much of mainland Europe. All are within the range of the Iskander. Worse yet, the fact that its launcher is built into an 8-wheel MZKT 7930 truck means it can be transported closer to a target if needed and fired directly from the truck. Each of these trucks carries 2 Iskanders. As for the warhead, Russia has choices. The base version of the missile is usually equipped with a high-explosive warhead that isn't nuclear, but can still pack a major punch. However, that can be replaced with a submunition, earth penetrator, or thermobaric warhead as the situation requires. The latter represents the biggest danger Kaliningrad poses to NATO countries. Also known as a vacuum bomb, a thermobaric warhead contains a fuel container with a pair of explosive charges. Once it detonates, the first charge splits the container, spreading a cloud-like fuel mixture far and wide. Buildings and other military defenses are penetrated by this cloud, with only those that are perfectly sealed from the outside world standing a chance. Then, the second charge detonates, and with that, the entire cloud goes up in flames, creating a massive fireball that generates a blast wave combined with a vacuum that sucks all of the surrounding oxygen out of the air to fuel the fire. Buildings and other structures nearby are destroyed, with anybody unfortunate enough to be caught in the blast being burnt to nothingness. Or if they're further away, being subjected to the combined force of the blast wave and the feeling that air is basically being sucked out of their lungs. These are devastating weapons, with the only solace being that the Iskander's thermobaric warheads are limited to 1,543 pounds. That's still enough to cause plenty of damage, though it pales in comparison to the GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, MOAB, nicknamed Mother of All Bombs. Developed by the US in 2003, this vacuum bomb weighs over 21,600 pounds. It's unknown exactly how many Iskander missiles are in Kaliningrad. However, it was reported that they were sent to at least 7 of the 10 missile brigades stationed in the oblast back in 2016, suggesting there are plenty to go around should Russia launch an attack from there. And it gets worse. In June 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin promised that Moscow would send some of its Iskander missiles to Belarus in the coming months. That development is notable for 2 reasons. First, Belarus is one of the few allies that Russia has in mainland Europe, with the country even having served as Russia's pathway into Ukraine during the early parts of the Ukraine war. Secondly, Belarus may provide a route through which Russia can funnel even more Iskander missiles into Kaliningrad. After all, it borders the Suwalki Gap. This small stretch of land, which runs for about 62 miles along the Lithuanian and Polish borders, separates Belarus from Kaliningrad. It, along with its accompanying town of Druskininkai, was once designated an official Russian spa resort in the 19th century, with the region often being visited by Russian civil servants of the time. Right up until the Ukraine war, it was a popular tourist destination for Russians. It would likely be one of Putin's first targets if he began a war with NATO. Securing the Suwalki Gap would give Russia a route into Kaliningrad from Belarus. That could prove vital if NATO were able to cut Kaliningrad off from Russian ships in the Baltic Sea, as well as giving Putin more options for getting his missiles and troops into the Russian oblast. Perhaps an assault on the Suwalki Gap is in the back of Putin's mind. After all, he followed through on his June 2022 promises to Belarus, as confirmed by the country's exiled opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. In June 2023, he warned that Belarus's leader, Alexander Lukashenko, had proudly announced the arrival of the first Russian missiles and bombs to his country. Russia appears to be preparing for something. Still, some might justify Russia's actions in Kaliningrad as those of a country that's just trying to protect its territory. After all, the oblast is separated from the Russian mainland and has unfriendly countries on all of its borders. Perhaps Putin is just making sure Kaliningrad is protected. That might be the cause. However, recent Russian actions suggest that Putin has far more planned for Kaliningrad. Take his warnings to Sweden prior to the Nordic nation joining NATO. In April 2022, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, warned both Sweden and Finland that if they joined NATO, Russia would respond by strengthening its naval, air, and land forces in the Baltic Sea. Chillingly, he was explicit about the nuclear threat that would result, claiming that there would be no more talk of a nuclear-free Baltic if the two countries joined NATO. Medvedev urged Sweden and Finland to see sense. If they didn't, he warned, Kaliningrad will become home to not only the Iskander missiles that are already believed to be there, but Russian hypersonic missiles. Each could be used to strike Sweden or Finland. Granted, these threats weren't new. Kaliningrad is already home to Iskander missiles, and many European leaders believe Russia had stocked the enclave with nuclear warheads even before the issue of Sweden, Finland, and NATO arose. Still, Putin is stoking the flames of a fire that's already threatening to get out of control, and he's using Kaliningrad as the focal point of his threats. There are also the simulations to consider. The Arms Control Association, or ACA, reports that May 2022 brought with it several military exercises in Kaliningrad that focused on simulating nuclear weapons launches. These happened just a month after Russia delivered its threats to Sweden and Finland, with the clear message being that Kaliningrad not only hosts nuclear weapons, but that the troops stationed there know how to launch them. The ACA reports that the simulations involved electronic launches of Iskander missiles at targets including military command posts, airfields, and equipment depots. Over 100 troops were involved. Russia's rhetoric around the simulations focused on Ukraine. The leader of its arms control delegation in Vienna, Konstantin Gavrilov, claimed that Russia by no means pursues any nuclear war-related aims on the territory of Ukraine. Those comments were backed by Alexei Zaitsev, the deputy spokesman of Russia's foreign ministry, who said that the weapons being tested in Kaliningrad are not applicable to the implementation of the tasks set in the course of the special military operation in Ukraine. Perhaps they're both telling the truth. But in doing so, they also hide that the simulations served more to warn Sweden and Finland rather than to intimidate Ukraine. Even with all of this taken into account, some may see Russia's simulations and use of Kaliningrad to host Iskander missiles as little more than nuclear saber-rattling. It wouldn't be the first time that Russia has levied threats to the West, after all. That brings us to another question. What does NATO think about Russia's actions in Kaliningrad and elsewhere? For much of the Ukraine war, NATO has actively denied that there would be any chance of a larger war taking place between it and Russia. That's still the case, at least officially. The NATO website goes to great pains to say that NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia, instead painting itself as a force for defense and deterrence. It supports Ukraine in its right to self-defense, it says, which extends to allowing NATO members to deliver military aid to the beleaguered nation. However, there are suggestions that some inside NATO have started to seriously consider the possibility of war in 2024. In January 2024, those considerations were made clear by Bob Boyer, a Dutch admiral who serves as NATO's military committee chief. He said, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we are preparing for conflict with Russia." The "we" in this instance refers to NATO's forces rather than the Dutch military. Boyer's words were echoed by Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, who pointed out that "we hear threats from the Kremlin almost every day." He made specific note of those threats being directed at the Baltic states, which would fall well within Kaliningrad's missile firing line if a war were to break out. Then there are the French President Emmanuel Macron's comments in February 2024 to consider. He claimed that France and its European NATO allies couldn't rule out the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. Though he tempered these remarks by noting that there was no NATO consensus on the idea, and many NATO-aligned leaders were quick to say it wouldn't happen, the remarks were taken as a clear threat by Putin. Tensions escalated again, and Putin was quick to respond. Just days after Macron's statement, Putin delivered his annual State of the Nation speech. In it, he mentioned Sweden and Finland, both of which had ignored his warnings to join NATO, and claimed that NATO forces were preparing to strike our territory. He also touched on the idea that NATO-aligned countries might send troops into Ukraine, as suggested by Macron, which again led to nuclear threats. "Western nations must realize that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory," Putin said. "All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that?" More anger followed when several NATO nations, including the Baltic states, the United Kingdom, and crucially, the United States, gave Ukraine the go-ahead to use the weapons they supply on Russian territory. While some of those permissions come with caveats, the US says Ukraine can only use American weapons near the Kharkiv border, Putin has taken that as yet another act of NATO aggression. Russia accused NATO of provoking a new level of tension, with a Kremlin spokesperson named Dmitry Peskov noting that they are in every possible way provoking Ukraine to continue this senseless war. A senseless war that Russia started. All of which brings us back to Kaliningrad. If the rising tensions between NATO and Russia finally boil over, Kaliningrad would be at the forefront of the war. Russia would try to use it to take control of the Baltic Sea, kicking NATO out of the waterway and securing supply routes between mainland ports and Kaliningrad in the process. It may also use Kaliningrad as the starting point for its attacks. Even if Russia doesn't resort to using its Iskander missiles to strike European targets immediately, Kaliningrad is also home to supposedly up to 200,000 military personnel. Notably, that's more than the current Lithuania armed forces, suggesting that these soldiers may be used to launch an attack on Kaliningrad's Baltic neighbor, in what would be the first move in a Russian effort to take the rest of the Baltic states. Likewise, NATO sees the strategic importance of Kaliningrad. Those Russian soldiers may be forced to stay in the exclave as a defensive force as NATO attacks from all sides. Lithuania would likely send in troops, relying on Latvia and Estonia to defend against Russian encroachment from the east, while Poland would also attack the exclave. It's also worth noting that Poland is already taking steps over Kaliningrad. In May 2024, The Guardian reported that Poland had started naming Kaliningrad Królewicz in its official documents. That's the name the territory had when it fell under Polish rule in the 15th and 16th centuries. Perhaps that's a sign that Poland considers Kaliningrad its own territory, which could raise future questions within NATO about what would happen were it to win a war against Russia. Alternatively, Poland may have made the move to poke at Russia and showcase how it doesn't want to return to the Soviet era. That's certainly the impression that Waldemar Buda, Poland's Minister of Development and Technology, gave when he said, "We do not want Russification in Poland, and that's why we've decided to change the name in our native language of Kaliningrad and the Kaliningrad region." Regardless, were it not for its missiles, Kaliningrad would likely be easily overrun by NATO, taking away one of Russia's largest nuclear threats to the rest of Europe. Still, we can't forget that this threat exists. Perhaps any NATO attempt to take Kaliningrad would lead to Russia turning its Iskander missile simulations into a reality. Sweden, Finland, the Baltics, and Poland would all be potential targets, with none of them having nuclear threats of their own with which to counter Russia. But perhaps they don't need those threats. After all, each of these countries is a NATO member, with Article 5 of the NATO Charter meaning that all other members have a duty to collectively defend them. That would bring the US, UK, and France into the nuclear game, which collectively have 5,749 nuclear weapons at their disposal, according to the ACA. Granted, not all of those weapons are active, with the US in particular being in the process of retiring around 1,400 of its nukes. Still, that collective nuclear power is enough to rival Russia, which has 5,889 nuclear weapons available. Perhaps the threat of global nuclear annihilation would be enough to prevent Putin from pushing the button. That seems unlikely, not only because Kaliningrad represents a vital strategic position to Russia, but also because the country's president has demonstrated through the Ukraine war that restoring Russia to its former glory is a key motivator. He wouldn't be willing to sacrifice Kaliningrad to NATO, which may be why he has such a powerful nuclear deterrent installed in the exclave. Still, there may be another route for NATO: Kaliningrad's people. Many of them believe that Kaliningrad should no longer be a part of Russia. Instead, they wish to transform the territory into a fourth Baltic state, operating independently of its current Moscow masters. That's the impression that the Human Security Center gives when reporting on the action that some Kaliningrad natives took after the Ukraine war began. For instance, many of its citizens, who refer to themselves as Baltic Russians, took to the streets of Poland when Russia began its war. There, they protested in front of the Russian embassy and threatened to hold a referendum for Kaliningrad's independence should the Kremlin fail to demilitarize the exclave by 50% and de-escalate the tensions in Ukraine. Russia did neither. That resulted in the creation of an online referendum that took place in 2023, covering 5 Russian regions. All 5 voted in favor of independence from Russia, with Kaliningrad's population being overwhelmingly in favor. The referendum took place over 13 days and saw 19.4% of the exclave's population deliver their votes. After the 95,567 votes were tallied, it was found that 72.1% favored independence. There are caveats here. The referendum was non-binding and, in Russia's eyes, potentially illegal due to the challenge it presented to Russian sovereignty. That may explain the low turnout, though the suggestion remains that the people of Kaliningrad would welcome freedom from Russia and a chance to further engage with the wider European community. Of course, Russia won't hand over Kaliningrad so easily. It certainly won't allow it to become independent, though the desire for that independence could open the door for NATO propaganda to win the day in a war. Kaliningrad won't start a war between Russia and NATO in the sense that its people will begin the fighting, but they won't have a choice if war erupts. Kaliningrad will be at the center of everything. Russia will use it to launch missiles against NATO's European members, as well as potentially use it to fight, along with Belarus, to isolate the Baltic states. NATO will fight for Kaliningrad to remove a clear Russian threat to the NATO members, Lithuania and Poland, that share a border with the exclave. They may also be able to use Kaliningrad to create an inroad into Belarus, which would likely support Russia in a wider war. The exclave is a powder keg. The question now is, will Russia or NATO light the fuse? Let us know what you think. Is Kaliningrad really going to be at the center of a war between Russia and NATO? If so, how important do you believe securing the exclave will be for either side if war erupts? Share your opinions below, and thank you for watching the video.